When we had the introductions, and I said, and we were asked, what were the questions that we asked ourselves? The first question that came to my mind was really the oldest question that faces us all, which is, who am I? And I'm going to talk a little bit about that, and the kinds of things I want to explore with you. A little bit about the nature of consciousness, a little bit about the relationship of what we normally experience to what we normally think of as the physical world, and then also a little bit about how the conscious mind relates to the unconscious mind, and ultimately, hopefully, these little fragments of thought will relate in a natural way to the kinds of issue that we've been discussing. As Andy said, I have a book, and which bear with me. This is I'm not. Well, I am trying to say it right. No, but my real reason. Well, no. Okay, part of my reason for mentioning it, I have just one copy of it, and what I'm going to do with you are just little fragments of this. So I'm taking a few elements out of it and exploring it with you. And if you think you're interested, because some of what I'll say is going to be really familiar to you, some of what I say, even if you kind of understand what I say, you won't kind of understand what I say. Because you'll grasp what I'm saying, but you won't grasp the implications, and that'll become evident to you later on. If you want to explore it further, the whole system of thought within which the fragments that I'm going to explore with you are embedded are in the book, and at the back I've just I might have about 40 flyers. There aren't enough, but I'm assuming that only some of you will be interested. You could just pick up a flyer from the back and tells you a little bit more about the book and how you can get a discounted price on it as well. All right, as I said, the topic of the talk is the unconscious ground of being, and I'm going to take 3 roads to it. They're not the only roads. In fact, I've been fascinated to see how many of you are exploring this in your own ways anyway, both, in private conversations with some of you, but also in some of the workshops. But my own form of work, my if you like, my academic work, is squarely lodged in the academic tradition, as it should be, and departs from a scientific philosophical worldview. So what I'm going to be doing with you is science and philosophy, but of a slightly different sort to the sort that you might have become accustomed to in the past. So the 3 routes that I'm going to take, I'm going to say a little bit about how what we think of as the world of appearances, how things look, actually relates to what reality is like as described by science. And I think there are a few surprises there. Well, sort of surprises. And then how the phenomenal world relates to the physical world. A fairly central issue, although you might think it's quite simple. And then, as I said, I'm going to also turn a little bit to how what we experience of our own minds relates to the nature of our actual minds. The first one is the easiest, and I'm going to just pass over it quickly by making something which is really quite standard. This really should be familiar to you, at least in terms of its details. And the basic point is that the world we actually experience is only a small fragment of what the various sciences that we have developed tell us is there. So, as you've probably all done in your school education, visible light is... Let's see if this works.
It's not visible.
No, this is... hang on. I think I haven't got the right button. There we go. Visible light occupies this thin little slice of... No, this is working. It's working. And the electromagnetic spectrum occupies this So human vision extends from about 400 nanometers to about 750. But as Richard Gregory, a famous vision scientist, once put it, in terms of the range of frequencies that we can see, the eyes are almost blind. Another really interesting fact, and it's also very well known to those who are interested in zoology and comparative psychology, is that our senses aren't tuned to the same ranges as other animals are. So, for example, honeybees can sense ultraviolet light, although they can't see red in the way that we do. So their, if you like, domain of their little window shifted higher on the frequency axis, just slightly. And what's this kind of interesting is an illustration of, obviously we can't tell exactly what the bee sees, but what you can do is simulate what kind of light reflectance patterns come off flowers if, for example, your eyes were sensitive to the ranges that the honeybee's eyes are actually sensitive to. And that's, for instance, a flower seen with normal vision, whereas, as you can see, the ultraviolet light has actually, the ability to detect it, has actually emphasized the center of the flower. So people who do this work speculate that that actually might be of value to the honeybee. Just to take a few more examples, if we compare our hearing ranges with other animals, babies, for example, can hear maybe from about 200 hertz to about 20 kilohertz. Most of us, that drops off as you grow, so most adults wouldn't hear above 15 kilohertz. And it gradually goes down as you age, usually. But as you can see, that range of hearing is nowhere near as great as the range of the dolphin that can hear up to about 150,000 kilohertz. So you kind of wonder, why have they developed these senses? And what is it that they hear? What is it they can do with this sound? Another final, as I say, I'm just going to do this very quickly. Another final example is a chemical sense, and a sense of smell, where we actually use the sense of smell to detect different shapes of molecules which are floating around us of many different kinds, which carry information for us. And if we compare, again, humans with other animals, we don't do very well. So we've got about 12 million olfactory receptor cells in our nose. Rabbits have 100 million. Dogs are way off the scale as far as we're concerned, 1 billion. And the bloodhound is used for very good reasons for tracking because it's got 4 billion. So they live in an olfactory world of vast proportions compared to us. But the champion of all, I think, is probably the male silk moth. He's got these lovely little feathery antennae. And that male silk moth can detect a female at 10 kilometers. It's really useful. You know, and if you compare, so the number of molecules it needs within I think it's 1 cubic centimeter, is about 200 to make that detection. Whereas for us to smell anything, I've got an example of butyl mercaptan, which is a foul, putrid smell. And that requires 10 to the 7th molecules for us to even smell it. So again, we have this sense of this rich energy and information that we're bathed in, and we're just tuned to a little slice of it. And other species are tuned to different slices, and sometimes they're far superior to us in what they can do. Now, of course, it doesn't end there, but we're just talking about the sensitivity of the sense organs themselves. That isn't enough for perception. So behind the sense organs, which pick up the information, you have to have systems that process the information. So you have to have perceptual systems, and then perhaps cognitive systems, and many animals have both. And then, of course, many animals are also embedded in social systems, which also construct their worlds. And all that exists for us in spades, if you like, and leads to what I've come to think of as a peculiarly human world. So we tend to take it for granted that the world that we perceive is just as we perceive it to be. But it's only perceived as we perceive it to be because we're shaped in the way that we are. And just a few more examples. Some creatures actually operate in energy domains that we don't possess at all. So the old world elephant-nosed fish, it's a fish that lives in African heavily muddied waters, generates an electrical field around itself. And any perturbations in this electrical field provide useful information for it, enough to catch prey and to negotiate around objects. So we don't know what that feels like. What does an electrical field feel like? And other animals can pick up the Earth's magnetic field. So what is it to feel magnetism? And so on. And that all leads to a kind of view, if you like. And I say this standard science, nothing strange. And I love this quote from one of my heroes in psychology, William James, who really put this beautifully about 100 years ago. As he said, the mind, in short, works on the data it receives very much as a sculptor works on his block of stone. In a sense, the statue stood there from eternity, but there were 1,000 different ones beside it, and the sculptor alone is to thank for having extracted this one from the rest. Just so, the world of each of us, however different our several views of it may be, all lay embedded in the primordial chaos of sensations. We may, if we like, by our reasonings, unwind things back to that black and jointless continuity of space and moving clouds of swarming atoms which science calls the real world. But all the while the world we feel and live in will be that which our ancestors and we, by slowly cumulative strokes of choice, have extricated out of this, like sculptors, by simply rejecting portions of the given stuff. Other sculptors, other statues from the same stone, other minds, other worlds from the same monotonous and inexpressive chaos. My world is but one in a million alike embedded, alike real to those who may abstract them. How different must be the world in the consciousness of ant, cuttlefish, and crab. So the first bit of what I'm saying, which, as I say, is absolutely standard science, is there are many events bathing us, supporting us, and sometimes threatening us, which we're completely unaware of. And that's the first, if you like, inroad into a kind of sense of being embedded and supported by an unconscious ground of being. We can't exist with all these energies, even though we only sense a little slice of them. As I say, that's pretty standard, although it's pretty mind-boggling, when you reflect on it, but easy. The next bit is also, so to speak, staring us in the face, but a little bit more surprising. I'm going to ask for a little bit of audience participation at this point. I want you to try and locate your right index finger. Have you all found it? Okay, we're going to use this instrument for a very important purpose. I want to discuss the relationship of the physical world to the brain and to conscious experience, right? Now, I'm a bit of the physical world out here in space. Yeah? Is that okay? I'm okay so far. So I've got a body, I'm moving around out here. And you're over there, and you're perceiving me. And part of the process involved in your perceiving me is, well, most of it's going on in your brain. So your brains are in here, or at least for you. And the simple question I want to ask you, given that, in this case, what we call in psychology, the physical stimulus is out here, and your brains are where you are, and you're perceiving me, I want you to collectively point to your experience of me. Could you raise your fingers and point wherever you care to point? Just point to your experience. Okay, that's very interesting. Okay, okay. Now, notice that you're pointing in different directions. Most of you are pointing like that, which is the classic way to think. But some of you are kind of pointing at me. Now, this issue, simple though it is absolutely fundamental. It's absolutely fundamental. Because depending on which way you pointed, you come to a completely different philosophical position. You come to a completely different understanding of the relationship between the physical world as we normally understand it, bodies and brains and conscious experience. Now, what I want to put to you is that actually, if you reflect on it just for a moment, the actual situation is like that. In other words, if I actually ask you let's say you did point in your head like that to your conscious experience, but then, we say, okay, look, forget theory for the moment, forget, one's understanding of the situation prior to the experience you're actually having. Simply look at me and describe your visual experience. You're having a visual experience as you look at me. So, look at the colour on this mic. It's black. And then I ask you, where would you locate that black patch that you can see? Well, the only black patch I can see when I look down there is down there. Or, where are the stripes on my shirt that you can see? And again, they seem to be attached to my shirt. And where's the blue colour? Well, it seems to be attached to my trousers. And then ask yourself another question. Is there any content of experience, visual experience, that I'm having when I'm looking at the black patch here, for example, that is a kind of black patch as experienced inside my head? Do I experience a black patch inside my head? And the answer has to be no, if you're like me. And if you actually ask yourself about the content of your visual experience relating to my body, the only content of the visual experience that you're having is this body extended out here in space, which is moving as I move. And the same applies to your own body. So if you, let's say, direct your attention to your feet and say, well, okay, I can feel the pressure of my foot against the floor. Where do I feel the sensation? Or put your fingers together and say, where's the sensation of pressure? And you see it's at the fingertips. And then, if you reflect on that, that's really odd. I mean, when you're having a pressure sensation at your fingertips, you're not simultaneously having another sensation in your brain. It's at your fingertips. Nevertheless, something going on in your brain is resulting in a pressure sensation at your fingertips. In the same way that something in your brain is resulting in your experience of me out here in space. And I call this phenomenon perceptual projection. It's not, perceptual projection is just a description of the phenomenon, just drawing attention to something. There isn't an explanation. But it's something that's going on all the time. Now, I'm not saying that everything that you experience is out there in space or in your body. So if, for instance, you have a thought, you might be running some you experience what we call verbal imagery, and that has very poor localization. So if you think of your mother's maiden name, have a think, and note what it is. And then I ask you, well, where was that experience? And you might say, well, it wasn't anywhere, or maybe it's in there. Or if I ask you, if you reflect on an emotion, and I say, well, tell me about the phenomenology of your emotion. And then you might say, well, and I won't ask you to generate an emotion at this point, but you might feel it here, or you might feel it here, or it might be a combination of bodily experiences and thoughts and so on. And so, if you like, the point I'm trying to make is that even before you can begin to understand consciousness, theoretically, you have to describe it accurately. Because if you get it wrong right from the start, you can't get it right. Sorry, if you get it wrong from the start, then you can't get it right in your theorizing. So if you think of consciousness as something in here, you're talking about a consciousness that doesn't have any phenomenology that corresponds to being in here. So you're actually talking about a fictional kind of consciousness for most forms of consciousness. And that starts to change things in a very profound way. Let's say it's just one step. And remember at the beginning I said I'm going to tell you something and then I'm going to say a little bit more about it. But you won't really be able to get the sense of all the consequences that follow from making that simple step, because it's a long story, and I'm only going to be able to do a little bit of it. But just coming back to the diagram then, so basically, and this is what I call a reflexive model of perception, which is a kind of microcosm of a much bigger process that hopefully I'll get a chance to say just a tiny little bit about at the end. This very simple example of something much larger.
Max, can I briefly interrupt? Can you define what you mean by consciousness?
By consciousness, I use the word in a very simple way. And for me, the contents of consciousness are just everything that we experience.
So it's only a human?
That's true. That's true. It becomes very important later on. But I don't want to deviate into that yet, because the enormous fields where people use this term in many different ways, and it's very important to understand the different ways that people use these terms in different traditions. So I'm talking from a Western perspective about what's usually referred to in philosophy of mind as phenomenal consciousness. And that's the most immediate form for us. So we're literally talking about things that we are experiencing now. That's part of my consciousness. And anything that exists, which I'm not experiencing now, is not part of my consciousness at this moment. It's as simple as that. And bigger debates have to wait for the moment in terms of other usages of the term. So that's the simple situation. Here's a cat out in the world, and let's say I was a psychologist trying to work out what's going on. I've got a stimulus over here, I've got a subject over there, I'm trying to describe the relationship of the stimulus to the subject's brain and their consequent experience and so on. So I'm E, the experimenter, and I've got my stimulus, which happens to be a cat. A cat is perceived by an external observer, E, light rays traveling from the cat to the visual system of the subject. This produces activation in the occipital regions of the brain and associated regions that form a kind of neural representation of the cat. Then other, really interesting things happen in the brain, which we're not going to go into and we don't fully understand yet, but we have some interesting ideas, also have to happen before that information originally arriving at the brain become conscious, and we'll call that certain neural causes have to operate, and then eventually the correlates of consciousness form. And that's the end of the neural story you can tell from the outside. You're observing the brain, and that's all you can see in there. You can't see somebody's experience. Then you ask them, okay, tell me about your experience. And they should say, well, I see a cat out there in the world. That's my experience. And so it's reflexive. So you start off with information out here, and an entity out here, interacting with another entity here, which is structured in a certain way to experience things, winding up in this entity experiencing this entity being out here in space. And of course, this entity over here has its own view of things. You know, the cat also sees you, and so on. And is this? No, it's still working. No, it's not. I've got another one. Is it? Yeah.
No, it's not.
Oh, okay. So that's a reflexive model of perception, and I will argue that, you know, as I say a little bit later on, that's kind of systematically, there's a fundamental principle that's at work here in the way things are organised. And perceptual projection, which is this funny phenomenon that I'm talking about, can be summarised this way, that there are non-conscious processes within the brain which produce these consciously experienced events, which seem to be subjectively located beyond the brain, and it's an effect, you know, it's not a theory, and I want to stress that I'm not suggesting that something physical is coming out of the brain. You know, that was a theory, actually. Empedocles, I think, had that theory of perception, that literally rays came out of the eyes, you know, to light up the world. But I'm not making that kind of claim. I'm just saying, look, there's an effect here, psychological effect, and we need to understand it if we're going to understand consciousness. And then I'm not going to show you many of the ways that we investigate this. That would be an example of how you might investigate perceptual projection. You've probably all seen these stereograms. You know, they're cards that you bring up to your eyes and you gradually take them away. And normally, and this is really important to realize, normally all the processes that produce our experienced world operate preconsciously. All we know consciously is that there it is. We have no access whatsoever introspectively to the processes that produce this integrated experience. But we can study it by interfering with the process in some way. So in this case, what you could do, for example, is put someone in a brain scanner, have them look at one of these cards before the three-dimensional image forms, and then gradually observe the changes that are taking place in the brain as the depth forms. You won't be able to do it because it's up on the screen and so on, but actually that, once you get the 3D effect, turns out to be a kind of helix, double helix, and there's a kind of curved surface behind it, you know, concave curved surface behind it. So that would be just one of many examples of how you could study this. So I'm not going to do a lot of this. Virtual reality forms a wonderful existence proof for what I'm talking about. One of the things that confuses the example for many people is that there really is kind of a physical world out there, and so you're not quite sure whether you know, how could that be an experience? And I'm going to talk about that in a second as well, but in the case of virtual reality, there isn't even a physical world out there. So what happens is, in this particular form of virtual reality, is that the light energy that you'd normally get reflected from a cat in the world, and the way it changes as your head moves, is simulated by creating the same pattern arriving at the left and the right eye for the subject. And because the brain receives the same pattern of light as the head moves, it constructs what it normally constructs and projects it. The model the brain produces, or the mind produces, brain-mind, let me talk about it that way, because is of an object out there in the world. And that they can be very persuasive, but you know, simple time constraints are going to prevent me getting too much into that. Well, I'm going to talk a tiny bit about some of the consequences of making this simple move. And one is, hang on, I'm just reading which consequence I wanted to pick out, because there's so many consequences. The first thing I'm saying is that the virtual reality metaphor isn't a bad one. That the brain is modeling a slice of what's out there. And the actual world that we see is a kind of virtual reality. The only difference between that and the ones we construct is that in this particular case, the virtual reality actually does represent in a useful way the physical energies, etc., which are out there. Whereas with other virtual reality systems, there may be no reality to which the virtual reality corresponds, although there may be. So you can get virtual reality systems being used in medicine and so on, and no doubt we'll be using them to communicate with each other over telephones, you know, and so on. So be able to see who we're talking to in the form of a hologram or whatever. And then one of the point here, and this really is a bit mind-boggling, in terms of, you know, where is everything and, you know, what's happening when and so on. Normally, as a psychologist, I would say, let's say I'm getting back to me as the stimulus for your perception. I'd think of me as the physical object and the stimulus, yeah? And light rays are coming from me and stimulating your brain, and then you're having an experience. But actually, the truth of the matter is, by the time you've seen me, all your perceptual processing is already operated. So, in a way, I am the end product of your current, or recent perceptual processing. Not the beginning of it. You see what I'm saying? Well, I'm going to explain a little bit more, but I'm kind of saying, in the end, in a way, everything that you see is already the end product of what you, otherwise you wouldn't see it. How could you see this as a black colour unless, you know, your brain has already processed it as black, or you know, see that as flesh-coloured unless, you know, you'd already colour-coded that, and so on. Yeah? You have to have preconditions for everything that you see. And so that really starts getting, you know, putting the cat amongst the pigeons a bit. You know, am I physical or am I psychological? You know, which way are we going to go with it? Or is it somehow both? And I'm going to kind of just suggest that, well, in a way it's both. It depends on the way you look at it. And this is a nice little demonstration of it. You can all see that shape and see the lines going from left to right. And if your visual systems are like my visual system, you'll see they're angled in different ways. Yeah? But the truth of the matter is that that is an illusion, and all the lines are absolutely parallel, and all the little squares are absolutely square. So is that physical, psychological, or both? Well, there really are lines up there. You know, I could get a straight edge and measure them. I could carry out my physical measurements and tell you what's there, looked at from the point of view of physics. But what you actually see is a representation of what's out there. And that's the psychological aspect of it. So we can unpick both these meanings, yeah? And depending on what we're doing, it's important to do one or the other. And then coming to, again, a very quick kind of conclusion about, as I say, I'm doing snippets with you, doing it very quickly. Things become even more mind-boggling, if you like, if you're with me so far. If you kind of then extend your sense of what you're experiencing to the totality of what you're experiencing at this moment in time. Now, part of what you're experiencing at this moment in time is this world that seems to be extended out there, you know, beyond the body surface. But like me, you're also experiencing yourself. You know, so I've got this body stretching down to the floor. You know, it seems to extend down there, and my hands, you know, kind of doing this, and you're out there. And all of this is a construction. My body in the world is a construction. And it just kind of appears. You know, don't have to work on it. It's all happening preconsciously. And so the very sense of having a body in the world and of having a world and being placed in a particular way in the world is again supported by these unconscious, preconscious processes operating in the mind before the experience arises. And that's another sense in which we're kind of supported by an unconscious ground of being, in this case, operating in our own mind. So the third thing I want to really talk about is a little bit about that mind. So we're going to do a little bit of mind examination now. Oh, sir. Oh. I'm going to pass on. You know, I'll tell you about that later. I've decided I'm going to do that more in the conclusion now rather than do it now. I'm speaking to you, yeah? And as psychologists, really, we're very interested in the differences between conscious processing and non-conscious processing, or preconscious processing, or subconscious processing. These distinctions really matter to us. But none of us have any doubts within the field that speech production is a conscious process. You know, without consciousness, we couldn't do it. But we also know quite a lot about how speech production is done. For a start, you've got to have an idea somewhere to express. And we think of that as being encoded in some sort of, you know, neural semantic space or something of that sort, perhaps. That would be one way of thinking about it, you know, semantic maps. They won't be in words. And as I'm speaking English, I also have to know the syntax and grammar of English language. So I have to have a kind of knowledge of English grammar to start to produce sentences. And in addition to that, you know, for any idea I might care to choose to express, I could choose different words to express it. So I have to somehow pick out what we call mental lexicon or mental dictionary, you know, words that will actually capture the meanings. And then, of course, I have to combine my knowledge of the word meanings with my knowledge of the syntax in order to put the words in the right sequence. And then, of course, that's all still kind of inner. I haven't got to all this stuff yet. I've got to speak. And actually, that's really complicated. According to the estimate, which I've got up there from one specialist in this field, as many as 10 to 15,000 neuromuscular events take place in 1 minute of speech production. That's how fast things are moving in here. Yeah? And I'm waving my arms about, which I do too much, sorry. And I'm stressing, you know, and there's intonation patterns being added, and I'm watching you. And it's just happening. I don't know how I do it. Yeah? So all that, although we call it a conscious process, the truth of the matter is that if I actually am honest about what I'm conscious of, I can hear the sound of my own voice. I just saw that finger, you know, waving. I'm conscious of you, you know, because I can see, you know, I can see if anyone's asleep or whether you're still smiling or whatever, you know. And that's feeding into it somehow or other. But in a way, I'm no more conscious of what I'm doing than you're conscious of what I'm doing. The speed at which you are conscious of my speech is more or less the same as the speed that I'm conscious of my speech. You know, I've got a few little extra cues because I'm kind of related to the operations in my own mind, you know, in a different way than you are. But I'm not getting much more. So this, in inverted commas, conscious process is conscious in the sense that it results in a conscious experience. The processing itself is preconscious. Yeah? And, you know, I'm only really aware of what I said after I said it. Now, try some reading. That's another conscious process. And we always, you know, nobody in psychology doubts that's a conscious process. At least 10. Oh, okay. So just read it and just note when you experience. You should have something running over in your minds as you experience this. Yeah? Don't have to tell me what it is. But if you're like me, you will have said something to yourself like, if we don't increase the dustmen's wages, they will refuse to take the refuse. Now, there's something really interesting about this, which you won't have noticed yet. And that one word in here appears twice. This word and that word. But when you said it over to yourself, when it ran over in your mind, the first one was refuse, with the stress on the use, and the second time the stress was on the refuse. So although the same visual pattern appeared, you automatically gave it a different stress pattern. Now the only way you could have done that is if you'd already processed the meaning of it in the context of the sentence. So by the time the actual conscious experience of the sentence appears in your awareness, all the semantic and syntactic processing required to decode the sentence had already taken place. Yeah? And again, the process is just conscious in the sense that you're conscious of the result. Now, we have a final little thought experiment here. Just have a think. Decide on whether you followed me so far, and simply note whatever comes to mind. Just note. Yeah? Well, you've come to some sort of decision. I really don't mind what it is, at least for the purposes of this. So you might have said, look, I'm with it so far, or, you know, I wasn't attending to what he was saying anyway, or you know, there's some things I don't quite get this, you know, and really that isn't the point. You know, the point is you made a judgment, and something came to mind. And then you ask yourself, where did that come from? It just appeared. But actually, it's a really complex process. In order to make an assessment of, you know, whatever your state of understanding was, you had to have kind of done a kind of global state of the system evaluation, your cognitive system. So you already have a kind of knowledge of the world and all your understandings, you know, relating to the things I'm talking about. You've listened to me. You've done all this complex, you know, speech perception. You've decoded it. You've tried to fit the ideas into an existing framework. And you've either managed to do it or not. And on the basis of that, a thought has arisen which has given you a kind of, how's it going so far statement. Yeah? But that thought itself was produced by preconscious processes in the unconscious mind. And if we well, okay, given I'm sensitive to the amount of time we've got here. Given that I'm going to do this very quickly. No. I always run out of time. That's why I actually mentioned book. Again, look, I'm just going to say something, and I can't really justify it for you. It takes a lot to justify what I'm going to say to you. Obviously, the question arises, and I've only given you a little slice of, if you like, the problem. You know, if for instance, it's a general, let's say it's a general thing, that generally it's the case that when you're talking about a conscious process, a conscious mental process, the actual consciousness follows the process to which it most closely relates, as was the case in these three examples. Then, of course, you kind of want to say, well, what does the consciousness do? And this is a really deep issue, which I'd love, you know, I'd need another hour to really get into, but I'm just going to tell you what it does. Yeah? And then you can just think, well, you know, so what, or whatever you want to think. And the suggestion I want to make to you is that there's something obvious that actually becoming aware of something does, as opposed to not being aware of it consciously. And the word that makes sense to me is the word realize. It makes it subjectively real. It's when I become aware of something that it becomes part of my subjective reality. This is, for me, the heart of the issue. So, you know, when I hear myself talk, I realize what it was I'm trying to say, You know, when you just did this bit, you know, and you tried to work out whether you were following me or not, you realised whether you were following me or not. It became subjectively real for you before it was tacit. And getting more deeply into some of the issues I really want to spend a little bit of time with, that's true all for my wishes and conscious. You know, when I want something, you know, I realise what I want. If I have a desire, you know, I realise what I desire, and so on. And so the mind is kind of making evaluations of stuff as well as producing stuff. And starting to go a little bit further, I could have done a thing on free will for you. You know, am I consciously in charge of what I do? And that's a very interesting story. But let's say, well, if I had time to tell the story, you could give a similar tale for that. You could say, look, by the time I've had a conscious wish to do something, something has already produced that wish. But equally, when I act in the world, I can make an evaluation. So let's say I've acted on something, and I have feelings associated with that action. Or I have feelings before I act, and I decide not to act. Those feelings and decisions, you know, to withhold doing something or to feel good or bad about doing something, are arising from my own mind in the same way that these judgments about, you know, whether you're following me or not just arise. So here we have, if you like, an unconscious ground of being, a very personal one, the nature of our own minds, bringing things into our conscious experience which evaluate things. Now, in order for it to evaluate things, say our feelings about what we're doing in the world and so on, there has to be, within the nature of our own minds, already a kind of basis for making the value judgments. You know, why do we feel good or bad about acting in certain ways? You know, where do the deeper concerns come from? Comes from somewhere. We've run out of the 10 minutes, have we?
Yes.
Okay, well, I'm going to go very quickly. So what this does is to generate a different sense of self. So, you know, my take-home message for me when I, you know, unpack this sort of stuff is I start thinking about myself in a different way. I start thinking, well, okay, there's the conscious bit of me, the things arising in consciousness, and actually there's big support for all this. There's my own kind of deeper mind is bringing these things into my awareness. And of course, this deeper mind is interconnected with the surrounding world. Following the first theme, you know, how far the interconnections stretch is kind of another very interesting issue to explore. So I shift my sense of self to that. But another immediate consequence for me is that this recognition that I'm kind of almost floating, you know, in this physical, embodied, and mental world, and that stuff is coming up from it, that, you know, that are informing my actions and so on. A recognition of that actually gives me a kind of feeling of support. And it's possible to, you know, there's a lot to be said about this, but once I have that recognition for me, it's actually possible to kind of engage in a kind of dialogue with this. So I suppose, you know, I'm really cutting lots of stuff short because, you know, lots of slides I've left out, but one of these in time. The kind of bridge that I'm talking about now.
Let's take another 5 minutes more.
Are you sure?
Yes.
Okay, well, I want to say this, the bridge I'm talking about now is a personal bridge. So the fact that I have no doubt that I'm sitting on, you know, in terms of what I consciously recognize as myself, as being supported, produced by, B, supported by a vast set of mental, physical, interconnected processes, and I'm open to how far they extend. They're obviously very interesting social extensions, as well as personal world extensions, as well as deeper extensions, which many of you explore. Firstly, creates a different sense of being in the world. So I recognize only too well, because I used to be there as a teenager, feeling this isolated being, you know, with everything separate, you know, cut off from A, the world, B, other people, and just being this conscious, embodied, you know, lost being in the world. Very, you know, I kind of was a prototypical Sartre. Actually, I wanted to study at the Sorbonne, you know, under the feet of the master, but couldn't speak French. So that's a very different feeling for a start. But the second thing is that kind of then opens up, for me anyway, this issue of reconnecting, the possibility of reconnecting with the deeper recesses of my own being. And that actually, in many traditions, is the path. So you'll find it in Jung, the journey from the ego to the self. You'll find it in many of the spiritual practices, where it's bringing into consciousness that which is latent, and for me at any moment unconscious. And what that provides is that sense of support and joining and being part of, which itself, for me, demands a different way of being in the world. Perhaps I'll leave it at that. Yeah? Okay, thank you.
Your main point that our conscious thinking is an evaluation of what has been going on in a process which is unconscious. Yeah. Leave the question open. Who does the process?
Yeah, absolutely. This is the question, or one of the questions. And all I've done for the moment is said, look, in order to answer that question, you have to kind of point inwards. And both inwards and the inwards is also embedded in what we think of as outwards. So I mean, for example, you can give answers at many different levels and from many different disciplines. But let's say you're just staying with physics, for example, which I'll just stay with just at the moment. You know, but I'm happy to go in many different directions. You know, I'm really interested in all of them, east and west. But you know, if we think of ourselves as, you know, being composed of this you know, quantum mechanical foam or whatever, and embedded in a wider, you know, quantum mechanical foam, and I happen to be a kind of clump bunch of these things over here, and you're other clump bunches of things over there, and we're still embedded in the whole thing, if you like. Now, where this bit that I think of as me separates from this bit that you think of as you, and from the thing that we're actually lodged in, becomes a very interesting question, you know, and a long process, you know, you can go on. but that would be one way of approaching it, and so all I'm really saying is, for me, it's very meaningful to get in touch with my deeper self, and of course I only do that from a first-person perspective as a human being. You know, much more personally, I'm much more interested in that. You know, as a living, you know, one of you. Yeah.
You would be opposed to the, for example, the Buddhist point of view that there is a level of consciousness which is non-material.
No. Well, okay. Now, one thing that's really important if one is trying to kind of relate the Western discourse to the Eastern discourse is that so far anyway, when I've been talking about consciousness, as I said right at the beginning, I'm talking about ordinary phenomenal experience. That's all. Now, if one, let's say, goes into some altered state, then that then becomes one's conscious experience. And if that altered state, let's say, at least hypothetically, corresponds in some way to some existing reality, then the obvious way to think about it from a Western point of view is that if that's true, then there must be a different physical description of that alternative reality. Now, the deeper the experience goes, perhaps the more fundamental the description has to be. And so the process of changing one's experience, say transforming it to a deeper experience, would lead someone who is an adept in such a tradition to say that right when they got to the end of that process, what they experienced was still a kind of pure consciousness. Mm-hmm. Even though to us that's unconscious, and then you have to get into a kind of different dialogue. Because I'm now saying, look, we're little bits. I haven't got to this bit. I haven't even got to my reflexive monism, which is kind of the heart of the philosophical position. But you have to ask, how come we've got what we've got? It's not just where do our bodies come from, but why is it possible to experience anything? And the very least I think you have to say is there's something in the fundamental nature of things which enables both these things to emerge, to co-emerge, in fact. They co-emerge. And then you have to say, well, what's the ground of being? For us, the unconscious ground of being, because we're not normally in contact with it, that has the potential within it for this particular configuration that I think of as me to kind of emerge. And it has this combined conscious experience physicality, if you like. So I think of it as psychophysical. Yeah?
Thank you.
Your hero, William James, is very interested in extrasensory perception.
Sure.
I wonder what you make out of that.
Well, that's funny you should ask that question, because that's exactly the point at which I stopped, just before I got to that. Yeah.
Well, could you start up again?
Yeah. When I started doing consciousness studies, I remember going to, I went to a conference in Italy, which was, I think it was biocybernetics, and it was on consciousness studies. And some of the people there that come from Boston, who are Boston vision scientists. And this guy had this wonderful PowerPoint demonstration, but the first thing he said was, I'm very surprised to find myself at a conference on consciousness, because it's well known in the United States that consciousness is a CLM. And, like you, CLM, and I didn't know what he was talking about, so I asked him. And he kind of looked at me as if I, was a bit stupid. He said, "Oh, a career-limiting move." Right? And the truth of the matter is that parapsychology is now, or has until very recently been in that position. Now, I, for one, I was actually, again, I'd love to talk about this, but I haven't got time. I have very good reasons for having no doubt that some very strange things really do take place. If I may mention a book I'm currently reading, it's a wonderful book, actually, which is a kind of big, fat compendium of scientific work and also observational work on just this issue. It's called Irreducible Mind, Towards a Psychology for the 21st Century by the Kellys. You may know them. I think it's a great book.
What's it called?
Irreducible Mind, Towards a Psychology for the 21st Century. Now, again, we have to be discriminating. There's a history of fraud in some of these areas, and there's also a possibility of self-deception, but there are also phenomena which are quite extraordinary. I, for one, in no way dismiss this. And taking these phenomena seriously, in the end, will require us to expand our notions of the world in many different ways. That'd be my view.
Could I probably ask one question for myself as well? If you say that you have to identify yourself with your unconscious ground of being.
Partly.
Partly, okay.
Yeah.
Probably that's an answer, because would this also mean that a victim has to identify itself with a actor, because the actor, or I don't know the English word.
No, I understand what you're saying. And the point that I was trying to stress, first of all, let me just slightly, it's very easy to give the wrong impression, when you kind of say something in a very brief period of time. I'm both my conscious experience and the supporting ground. It's as much one thing as the other, and all I've done is allowed something else as well. And for me, the unconscious bit is me. It's as much me as the conscious bit. So when I say, am I consciously speaking? I am speaking, even though I'm consciously, or realize what I'm saying, once the experience arises. When I consciously decide to do something, I have made that decision. I am responsible, because I am the unconscious ground, as well as, or the bit I'm responsible for anyway, which is the bit that I normally associate with as myself. I'm legally and ethically responsible just as much. When I decide to act on a wish or make a decision and so on, I've just extended my sense of self, that's all. I think that answers your question. There isn't a Deus Ex Machina now in charge, it's me.
Yeah, probably we are at the end now.
Yes.
Do you have a short question?
No, later.
We have the panel. We have the panel
I'm
still.
sorry.
It's okay. So save your questions. It's ongoing.
Okay.
No problem.
Thank you.